Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the MakdisiStreet podcast. Today, we're very happy to have with us a guest that really doesn't need much of an introduction, Professor Jeffrey Sachs, who's a world-renowned economics professor, best-selling author, and a global leader in sustainable development and really geopolitics as well. Professor Sachs is the director at the Center for Sustainable Development at Columbia University, where he holds the rank of university professor, the university's highest academic rank. He had been at Harvard before that for many years. He's served as advisor to numerous UN Secretary Generals. We're very happy to have him join us today. Thank you very much, Jeff, for joining us on the MakdisiStreet podcast. We're honored to have you. I just want to come straight.
My pleasure.
Thanks. We just want to go straight, start with the global developments, and then talk more about what's going on in the region here. In a recent article, you say, and I want to quote you, you say, the recent BRICS summit in Kazan, Russia, marks the end of the neocon delusions, and that since the 1990s, the goal of American foreign policy has been primacy, aka global hegemony. So I'm wondering what this means exactly. So this idea of a liberal international order that the U.S. had been dominating, which seems to be evaporating before our eyes, at least sitting in Beirut, it seems to be disappearing. The questions about the UN, about international law, all of this seems to be very, very seriously questioned in a way that it wasn't before. And in the meantime, we have this rise of the BRICS in a kind of different world. Can you explain a little bit these developments as they pertain to the US, and perhaps even now that Trump has been elected, what this might have an impact?
For a very long time, maybe you could date it almost to America's beginning. In the 17th century, maybe you could date it to the sweep across North America in the 19th century, Manifest Destiny, or maybe you could date it to the post-World War II order when the United States assumed that it was the world leader. The so-called grand strategy, or the taken for granted strategy of America's elite, is that America should run the world. And to do that, the United States has created a worldwide network of military installations and CIA operations to try to run the world. Of course, it never achieved its goal because the U.S. is 4% of the world population, and much of the rest of the 96% doesn't want to be run by the U.S. But this aspiration is very deep in the American psyche. It comes with the power and the wealth of the United States, with a very militaristic vision of the world. If you don't like us, either get out of the way or we'll topple you or we'll invade you. And that has been American foreign policy for many decades. I think we should put aside the baby word of liberal in liberal order. There's nothing liberal about the United States. The United States is a militaristic regime that learned its militarism from the British Empire, which was the most militarized state of the 19th century. And the U.S. Learned at the knee of the British Empire. And the U.S. has been a militarized state pretty much nonstop since 1945. When the Soviet Union ended in 1991, the assumption of the U.S. Security elites or state elites is, well, we won. Now we are the most powerful country in the world in history. We are not the new Rome. We have surpassed Rome. No one can stop us. We can take down anyone. And that was the mindset of crazy people like Richard Cheney, Paul Wolfowitz, and many others. And every president that came in was basically instructed by them. You are the leader of the most powerful machine of military force and coercion in world history. You are the center of the world financial system. You can turn on and off the financial spigots to any part of the world. You are at the node of the world information system. You can survey and intercept and disrupt information flows to any place in the world. You're at the center of the world energy system. You can turn on and off the taps, and if they don't like it, you can blow up the pipelines to do it. So this is the mindset. It is definitely the mindset of the incoming U.S. administration, even if the means might be different. There's no change in U.S. mindset. It's not exactly a joke that Donald Trump tweets every day that Canada is the 51st state. It's partly taunting, it's partly a game, but I'm sure he has in his mind, why don't we own all that territory? Why isn't the United States the owner of Greenland, in fact, as he says every day? Because the Chinese and the Russians are going to have more control over the northern sea route, so we better literally expand the map. To my mind, these people are, playing the game I used to play in my childhood, the game of Risk, which was a fun game where the idea was to have your piece on every part of the board. That's how you won. You took over the world. You'd roll the dice, and eventually you'd wear down through a war of attrition your neighbor if you had more pieces on the board. But they play this with real lives. And they play it with brutality, cynicism, coercion, subterfuge, and they play it till today. I'm sorry to say it. It's just this is really the way the world is.
But Jeff, some people are, including you, I think, have been talking about a phenomenon called de-dollarization, which we hear a lot about. So could you explain what I mean, I think we're familiar with it, but just for our audience, could you explain what de-dollarization is? And also, more importantly for this conversation, could you then say, well, what does that mean for U.S. power, U.S. hegemony, U.S. authority, even U.S. prosperity itself, insofar as there is still prosperity in the U.S.?
Great. And as I was running on and on, I forgot to mention the main point, which is that this vision of the U.S. is delusional. That's the bottom line. I forgot to mention that. I did say the U.S. is 4.1% of the world population. We're about 335 million out of some 8 billion people. It's not enough to run the world. The U.S. is very proud of its military prowess and its technology, but frankly, there are a lot of countries in the world that can blow up the U.S. and can blow up the world. So it isn't hegemony. It isn't unipolarity. It isn't being the sole superpower, but it is a lot of power. I mean, no other country in the world even remotely comes close to this military archipelago of bases around the world. 80 countries estimated. They don't make formal lists, so we have to guess. Around 750 military bases. Britain still has a big network. Their nostalgia for empire is impressive, let me say, a little pathetic, but impressive. But the United States really stands on its own. Now, the state of affairs is that the U.S. has had several rude awakenings. It couldn't win, actually. Back in Korea, there was an armistice that ended that conflict. It certainly didn't win in Vietnam. It didn't win in Afghanistan. It didn't, quote, win anywhere, even though it beat the shit out of these other places. It couldn't actually achieve its political goals or often its military goals even. So the idea of unipolarity is a kind of textbook idea of some second-rate thinkers in my mind, but it is a prevailing idea. Now, what are the bases of this? The core basis is supposed to be size of the economy. Unfortunately for the U.S., it probably, in best comparative terms, is now a smaller economy to China. So this is a matter of tremendous frustration to the American leaders and their self-proclaimed unipolarity. Another feature of this is the role of the dollar, which means that when Lebanon and Saudi Arabia make a transaction together, make a trade, it's likely to be in US dollars, actually, rather than in local currency. Even when China trades in the Middle East or other places, up until recently, it has been in dollars. What does it mean in dollars? It means through US-based banks or banks that deal in US dollars, which mean that the banks hold dollar assets in the United States, either in counterpart banks or at the Federal Reserve. It also means that transactions pass through a US-controlled electronic system. The best known part of which is so-called SWIFT system, which is an interbank notification system for transactions. This means that the US has had a major ability to turn off financial transactions or to impose sanctions or to threaten countries that if they don't follow the US line, their banks will be cut off from international commerce. In other words, countries doing business in other parts of the world that have nothing to do with the US per se, but happen to settle the transactions through a US-based banking system. This is what the role of the dollar has meant. Now, as a monetary economist, I can tell you there's no intrinsic reason why Thailand and Brazil should settle a trade in dollars. There is every other way to do that, but you need to create the institutional mechanisms for a non-dollar settlement system. It could be in Thai baht, it could be in Brazilian reales, it could be in Chinese renminbi, but you need institutions and technical mechanisms to make such a settlement and a policy framework to do it. The dollar has been convenient for everybody up until recently. It became less convenient when the US government started confiscating your dollars if you got out of line. And so if you were the government of Venezuela or Iran or North Korea or Afghanistan, and most recently Russia, if the US Treasury didn't like you, well, your money's now our money. And the US froze $300 billion of financial balances that Russia held in dollar assets in a European institution called Euroclear, based in Belgium. The idea of the BRICS countries, which of course started with the acronym Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and then expanded to include Ethiopia, Egypt, Iran, and the United Arab Emirates, and now is expanding to another 9 countries in 2025, is that these are countries that don't want the US to be able to turn on and off the spigot. So they are re-engineering their financial transactions so that their settlements are impervious to US bluster. Of course, Donald Trump, even before he enters the presidency, has already waved his finger and threatened these countries if the BRICS dare to challenge the US dollar dominance, we will show you. Well, let's see. I doubt it.
But also, Jeff, like in terms, I mean, the U.S. has been able to finance its debt, which is obviously in dollars, because of the clout of the dollar in world markets, right?
So this is another issue, which is,
I mean, insofar as the U.S. power is tied to U.S. debt, which is 36 trillion or whatever.
There are two aspects in which this dollar role plays to the U.S. advantage. One is the capacity to meddle. the capacity to make one's own sanctions, the so-called unilateral coercive measures, meaning the U.S. says to another country, you don't trade with China or you don't trade with Russia, to make that effective has been the dominance of U.S.-based settlements. So that's the part that I was emphasizing earlier. There's another part, which is that if other countries are settling in your currency, they will want to hold your assets for their liquidity. In other words, they will want to hold dollar balances, dollar bank accounts. They may earn some interest on that, but rather low interest rates, because they need to hold those balances to be able to do their daily business. So in this sense, the U.S. has had very good financing terms for a long time, but kind of as a drunkard addict of running out your credit card, the United States has built up a tremendous debt because the terms of borrowing have been so easy. And now we're seeing that as other countries don't want to hold their balances, their liquid assets in dollars, they can hold them in renminbi, they can hold them in gold, they can hold them in crypto, they can hold them in other means. The terms of finance for the U.S. will worsen. Interest rates are rising, and that's not, in my view, only because of short-term cyclical factors, the inflation that arose in the context of the COVID disruptions and war. I think it is a deeper fact, which is that what Charles de Gaulle 60 years ago called America's exorbitant privilege is become less privileged as other countries are moving away from dollar reserves and dollar settlements. Now, economists debate, is this really happening? Will the BRICS get away with it? Is it empty bluster? Will Donald Trump's finger wagging be determinative and keep countries back? I can tell you, even within the BRICS, there are hesitations. Oh, maybe we shouldn't go this way. You know, maybe the U.S. will punish us. So there still is fear of the United States. You know it in the Middle East. I see the U.S. as, an arrogant, hubristic country that is a bit diluted in its power. But if you look around the Middle East, a lot of countries are terrified of the U.S. Or think we can't step out of line. They'll kill us, or they won't sell us the F-35s, or we won't get our spare parts for our planes, or they'll bring down our regime. So there is still a lot of question and debate about the trajectory of relative power. It's not so easy to quantify as measuring GDP, but my view is it's going to fade faster than people think. One other fact we should keep in mind, one other part of the debate: does the U.S. have a chokehold on the critical technologies? And there are several that are claimed to be chokeholds, the most important of which is advanced chips, very small 2 or 3 nanometer chips that are crucial for AI, for example. And it's claimed that the U.S. is going to keep the lead for years or decades. The second area is space technology, the capacity to put heavy payloads in space and to do other things in space. My own view, though I'm not, the final authority on any of these technologies, to be sure, is that claims of such technology chokeholds in the past have proved to be pretty ephemeral in practice. So I don't believe that the U.S. lead is so big, so decisive, that in the end it's going to be able to bat away the competition. I think the dollar will lose its preeminence. I think the BRICS will be a real counterweight. I think China will remain a very powerful, pure competitor and even larger economy, and certainly a larger industrial economy than the United States. And so my view is geopolitics is really changing, though, of course, the uncertainties about that are real. Every week, I'm looking for it right now on my desk, but I don't see it. Every month, I get a copy of Foreign Affairs magazine, which is the magazine of the Council on Foreign Relations. I view it as a kind of evidence of deep neurosis in the U.S. because every issue is a proclamation of America's continued and enduring primacy. Every article is a self-confirmation. We're still number one. We're always going to be number one. We're far ahead. China's collapsing. But I view this more like a Rorschach test or a psychological profile than I do a deep analysis of international relations.
Jeff, just before we get more into the region here, you've laid out this very compelling argument about the sort of the dollar, the development and the economy and the rise of BRICS and China. But in this larger competition for global hegemony, the question of the military side, so just the sheer number of military bases, the amount of money that the United States in particular puts into its military. We see it in the region. This kind of, every time we think that we hear the US is withdrawing from the region, we see it coming back in big force. In part because of, I don't know. We can talk about it later, but the special relationship with Israel, whatever that is, but also in the Gulf region and others, and trying to make sure that China doesn't come in, make sure maybe Russia itself is also doesn't come in as much. What is that? What is the relationship between just the military, the sheer military side versus the more economic development kind of side? How interconnected are they? Which is more important?
The military side is fundamental. It is itself based on economic and technological prowess. I would say most of the breakthrough technologies of the last 75 years in the United States were military based. I was thinking, why do we have such shitty trains in the U.S. Where you can't even reliably take a train from New York to Washington without it breaking down someplace? And it's because the military doesn't care. And so we don't put in the technology that China has put in, for example, for its nearly 50,000 kilometers of fast rail. The military just doesn't care about this in the United States. Where it does care, well, we've had the internet, we've had the digital revolutions, we've had microcircuitry, we've had remarkable technological advances, almost every one of which has been originated by the Defense Department in the United States. This is quite interesting. God forbid we should spend some money on human civilian purposes, but we're told by our libertarian-minded politicians that's a waste of money. But if we spend it on the military, it's salute the flag and get the money spent. And there are civilian spillovers as well from it. But it is the mindset, which is nothing is too good for the military. So ultimately, it is the military, because you look at the Middle East, who is on the U.S. sides, where the U.S. has military bases. It's regimes that feel that the U.S. is protecting them. Protecting them from what? From other countries, from their own citizens, who knows? But in any event, it's where the military bases are. What enables the U.S. to have those military bases? Well, $1.5 trillion of security spending per year. If you add up the Pentagon, the CIA, Homeland Security, the other intelligence agencies, veterans, and so on, you're at about $1.5 trillion a year. That's a lot. By the way, it's within reach of China, and it's not a unique number. Of course, Russia can't match it, though Russia's no slouch at this game. Europe doesn't try, because this is part of Europe's system, to be vassals of the United States in trade for protection, a kind of feudal structure of security relations. But this power is real, but in my view, it's not dominant. And Russian technology is really powerful. And even the Houthis can send missiles into Israel. The Houthis, it's Yemen. That's not China. That's not the cutting edge. The Iranians have hypersonic missiles. Pakistan has nuclear weapons. North Korea is an extremely sophisticated, militarized state. The most recent terrifying novelistic scenario of nuclear war, which I recommend to everybody, by the author Annie Jacobson, called Nuclear War Scenario, which is a very science-based account of how the world can end, begins with a missile attack on the United States from North Korea. It's absolutely one of the plausible scenarios. And so the idea that the United States stands alone or unique in this, I think, is hugely naive. And again, though I'm no military expert, I am I think a pretty good observer of technology over the centuries, having studied this for decades. One of the ways that the U.S. and before the U.S., Britain projected its power globally was not only the network of bases, but the Navy. And the Navy was deemed to be key to be able to move assets. Well, the Navy, in my view, again, I'm sifting through the expert opinions of others, is hugely more vulnerable than it was 10 years ago because of missile technology and space technology. And these big aircraft carriers can be blasted out of the sea, most likely. And they were supposed to be the whole base of U.S. power projection. So I hate the foolishness of American officials blithely talking about war with China in the coming years. But my own view is, if we survive it somehow, because maybe it would be the end of the world, but if we survive it, we probably lose the war, as most war games have shown.
Jeff, on this question about the U.S. and the Middle East, to switch to the Middle East a little bit. So you've said that the U.S. is delusional, or U.S. policymakers are delusional in their view of, grand strategy, in their view of a unipolar world that will last, in their view, forever. That seems to be the thinking. But what if we shifted to the Middle East and the perspective of the Middle East, where when people looking from the Middle East, will often say, well, but the U.S. is the dominant power. It has this military capacity you've talked about to bludgeon people into, or at least to try to bludgeon people into submission. So how does your thinking about U.S. delusion square with the reality that we see in the Middle East, which is essentially quiescent regimes, the changes in Syria, the crushing of the Palestinians? Yes, and of course there's resistance as well. So I'm wondering how that works in on the one hand, and on the other hand, the question of Israel. I mean, is Israel an outpost of the U.S., or is there something different about the Israeli-U.S. relationship?
I think both the U.S. and Israel are delusional about the long term. It's true, in the short term, they can kill a lot of people, kick the shit out of a lot of people. And the U.S.-Israeli alliance has been nonstop war. The best way to understand Netanyahu is very simple, in my view, which is that his political movement, the Likud, is based on one idea: never a Palestinian state. And therefore, Israeli control permanently over the land from the river to the sea. And that actually is the charter of the Likud from the very start. The idea that this is a Palestinian chant, not an Israeli chant, is a little bit of the twist of our narratives, but it's the Likud that talks about from the river to the sea, of course, and that's the goal. Then Netanyahu came into power in 1996, and what was the strategy? The strategy was, well, we're going to keep everything. They're not going to like it. There will be resistance. There will be Hamas. There will be Hezbollah. There will be other military resistance. Don't fight them per se. Just overthrow the governments that support them. Because as Netanyahu, I think, rightly said in the 1990s, it's not the militants or what they call the terrorists that are the ones that are the danger. It's their state backers. War is a big business. War is not an insurrection. Sorry. No matter what people think, war is an organized state activity that costs tens or hundreds of billions of dollars and depends on advanced technologies. War is a big game of big players. So Netanyahu's idea was, well, yeah, we don't like Hamas and so forth, but that's not the real story. The real story is the regimes that back it. And I have always been struck by what Wesley Clark told us many, many years ago about his visit to the Pentagon in September 2001. 7 wars in 5 countries, in 5 years, excuse me. That list came from Israel. That wasn't a U.S. Of course, Paul Wolfowitz and Doug Feith and others are part of this strong U.S.-Israel right-wing alliance. And the 7 wars, Lebanon, Iraq, Iran, Syria, Sudan, Somalia, Libya. We've done the list. Netanyahu's had 6 out of 7 so far, and he's gunning for the 7th. And he may get it, the war with Iran. So that's the basic idea. I think, pretty clear. Most big ideas don't get hidden from view. People like Netanyahu like to write books about them, bragging about what they're going to do. And Netanyahu's bragged about taking down the Middle East. He shows us maps at the UN of the good guys, which are the ones with U.S. military bases, and the bad guys, which are the ones that support the Palestinians. And we're just going to completely uproot the bad guys. Now, what has happened? What has happened is, yes, they've made a killing field across the Middle East. No results in terms of really remaking the Middle East. I quoted Tacitus recently. They made it a desert and called it peace. What have they done? Is Lebanon at peace? Is Syria at peace? Is Somalia at peace? Is Sudan at peace? Is Libya at peace? Is Iraq at peace? No. These are killing fields. These are bloodbaths. These are not normal states. This is the handiwork of the United States and Israel by design. But it doesn't produce the political outcomes. Now, here we are in the midst of a genocide going on in Gaza. On the one side, it is, I can't call it impressive exactly, but it is a fact that almost the entire world understands this is a genocide and says so, and bemoans it. And you have statements by every group imaginable, by the Arab League, by the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, by the G20, by the BRICS, by the UN General Assembly, and by the UN Security Council, but for the US veto against what's happening. So public opinion, such as it is nearly universally aghast at this, as it should be. But it goes on every day. And this is part of the drama and the mystery. This is the first prime-time, full video genocide in history, where we watch it every day, We watched the gloating of the Israeli Defense Forces. We watched the genocidal statements of the Israeli leaders. We watched the shameless, pathetic performance of American politicians. And one thing I'll say, on January 20, at least I'm going to celebrate the departure of Tony Blinken and Jake Sullivan. Biden hasn't been there for a long time mentally, but these lieutenants of his have really done a job. They are really nasty or stupid or some combination of the two. So all to say, what does this add up to? Well, you can kill a lot of people, but in the end, this is not making, even forcing a long peace. And I don't believe personally that Israel survives this. I think it could survive and should survive a two-state solution. That's what I've advocated for decades and what I continue to advocate even for today, knowing all of the practical challenges. But I don't think it survives as the great regional empire in the Middle East. Zealots have a real way of self-destruction, and this is zealotry at work in Israel.
But when you say Israel can't survive, Jeff, I mean, do you mean it as, are you talking sort of ideologically? Are you talking ethically, morally? Or are you talking, since you're talking about power, do you mean in terms of what it's doing now will ultimately be unsustainable in the sort of medium to long future?
Yeah, but I should define my terms. I'm saying if we're looking ahead a quarter century from now, will greater Israel be the reality? Meaning, will there be a state of Israel that controls all the land from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean, parts of Lebanon, parts of Syria, if these people have their wish, all the way to the Euphrates, because that's what it just says in Genesis. Do I believe that that's what the Middle East will look like in 25 years? No.
But why do you assume that the Israelis want peace as opposed to domination?
They don't want peace.
Exactly. So
no, that's the relevance of Tacitus. They made a desert and called it peace.
Right. They don't want peace, or they want peace on their terms. But in the end, Israel will not determine the state of affairs of the Middle East, nor will the United States alone, though it thinks that it will. In the end, it just won't be a Jewish state acting as a regional empire. It's not in the cards. It violates too many international laws, too much global opinion, too much even primitive ethics, not to kill tens or hundreds of thousands of innocent civilians. Most people believe that, actually.
We agree with you 100%. I think the world agrees with what you're saying. But the question is, like, when you say two-state solution, could we push you a little bit on that and ask you why, after all that has passed, should anyone advocate for? I mean, the two-state solution in a sense is gone because the Israeli colonization of the West Bank and Jerusalem is so extensive. Why not advocate for a single state, given the fact that we're talking about hypotheticals here, a single state where everyone has equal rights? Why should anyone be advocating for two states, one of which would still be, in theory, a supremacist state?
Because we are one vote away from a two-state solution that could end killing. It wouldn't end this question of whether the two states should become one state, whether there should be a federation, whether in the end it will become one state. And I think that it may well become that way. I have no problem with it myself becoming that way. But I believe in political terms, there was a vote, basically 170 in favor of two-state solution in the General Assembly, and a few opposed, essentially the U.S., Israel, Micronesia, Nauru, Paraguay, Argentina, and depending exactly on the vote, sometimes Czech Republic and Hungary, sometimes not. In other words, about 95% of the world has said two-state solution. The G20 this year said it. The BRICS said it. The OIC said it. The Arab League said it in Bahrain last year in Riyadh. The United States is, from a juridical point of view, the only blockade to that, not Israel. Israel cannot veto two states. I am not calling for a peace process, by the way. We've had a peace process for 57 years. I'm not calling for a peace process. I'm not calling for negotiations between the Palestinians and the Israelis. That is the least relevant, conceivable approach. I'm calling for the United States to change its veto, to be aligned with international law, global diplomacy, and the overwhelming opinion of the American people. So this is what I'm calling for. Now, what does that mean in practice? With a sovereign Palestinian state on the borders of the 4th of June, 1967, with control over the Islamic holy sites, with the capital in East Jerusalem, it means that there will be a state of Palestine and a people of Palestine and a place for Palestinians to live. Will it mean eventually one state? It could very well, by the way. It could mean a confederal arrangement in the future. It could mean two states that hate each other for the next 30 years, but don't kill each other. But to my mind, it would mean the end of this Israeli, I don't know, so many words come to mind, but this zealotry and this militarism with the world saying no more, Likud, no. There's going to be a Palestinian state, whether you like it or not. This is not your choice. This is about international law, and this is about peace for all the rest of us. Thank you. And you just have to live with it.
Sorry, Jeff, can I just to push you a little bit more on this? From where I stand, there seems to be a bit of a contradiction, because we're saying that there's delusion and that we have this U.S. now under Trump, but under Biden and Trump, and you've argued for a long time that there's this kind of continuity, especially certainly when it comes to the Israelis and it comes to the Middle East. So on the one hand, the U.S. is getting even more pro-Israeli officially, not in public terms, but in official terms, more weapons. Even now, Biden is sending another $8 billion. Even now, it's sort of as his goodbye gift to Netanyahu. Even now, to this day, we have this. We have the kind of Trump appointments that are coming in are these evangelical types, these people that believe in greater Israel, people that all of this. And on the other hand, you're still coming back to saying, well, we need to get the U.S. to remove its veto. What is it that's changed? I mean, how are we defining it and analyzing it so incredibly well and so realistically, in a sense, and at the same time coming back to a policy that says, okay, but still we're going to ignore all this and we still want the ideal solution, which I agree, most people in the world might want that. But if the U.S. continues like this, what is changed? Where do you see the change that's going to get the U.S. to remove its veto?
If you ask me, is what I'm advocating likely to happen? No. I'm perfectly prepared, as I have been throughout my whole life, to say what I believe, even if I don't think it's likely to happen, because I think it's the right thing to do. So I just want to clarify, I'm not making a prediction that this is about to happen. It might. The argument I'm making inside the U.S. is that Donald Trump wants to make America great again. Well, maybe the first step would be American sovereignty, because I don't believe any of this has been in America's interest. In other words, this isn't some great accomplishment of the U.S. to have led to $7 trillion of debt and mass bloodshed and diplomatic isolation of the United States through 6 wars that Netanyahu has called for. I'm trying to say this is not in America's interest. It also happens to have the, let's say, the added feature, which doesn't matter very much, I admit, but the American people don't want us to continue being accomplices to Israel's genocide. I say that it doesn't much matter because America is not a democracy in any operational sense when it comes to foreign policy or much else, by the way. It's a highly corrupted plutocracy. But when it comes to foreign policy, it's not even remotely a democratic institution. We're lied to every day. There's no deliberation. There's no attempt to discern the public views of issues, none at all. It's completely in the hands of the National Security Council and the CIA. We don't know, again, whether the president's been in the loop on much of anything for a long time because he's mentally, at least partly, incapacitated. But my point is, this is not in American interest. So it's a glimmer of hope. If you ask me, is it more likely to say, yes, we'll have 2 states than to say this coming year we'll go for the 1-state solution? I would say yes. But maybe I'm playing with numbers that one has a 10% or 5% or 3% chance and one has a 0.01% chance. So one may be much more likely, but still highly unlikely. But I'm trying to go with something that at least has a chance this coming year to stop the killing, stop the bloodshed, put a floor under what is now a Palestinian freefall. Also, by the way, look around the Arab world. Of course, some states are still in diplomatic recognition of Israel, which I can't really understand. I find it this was the time to break diplomatic relations, in my view. Genocide is a good reason for that, but they didn't do it. And they didn't do it because the U.S. military bases are there and for other reasons that we've talked about. But even those states say 2-state solution. Some of them say it actually pretty firmly right now. If the Arab world, maybe this, I don't know if you'll laugh or cry or whatever, but if the Arab world actually got its act together and said, we have leverage, we've waited 100 years for that. It hasn't happened yet. But if it did happen, that really could change things, by the way. If Donald Trump heard clearly from the entire Arab world, and it's not impossible, look, don't play games anymore with us. Don't bribe us with your F-35s. Don't bribe us. Don't talk about the Abraham Accords and what it's going to mean and try to pull us apart one more time. Our position is the following. And that's our position. And accept it or don't accept it, but that's our position. We've taken it to Beijing. We've taken it to Moscow. We've taken it to Brasilia. We've taken it to South Africa. That's our position. You know what? That would actually make a difference. It would make a difference.
Sorry, so much of what you're saying here is so admirable in terms of, pursuing a noble ambition of peace and so on, and obviously we share that ambition towards peace and justice. But part of what's happening, and you put your finger on it too, is there's also increasingly a gap between U.S. popular opinion and the policy-making establishment run by the lobby in Washington. Our last guest before you was John Mearsheimer, incidentally. So we're talking all about this. But the crisis we see on our campuses, you're at Columbia, I'm at UCLA. I mean, like our campus is I mean, I know your campus is like a, fenced off from the world now. Our campus is essentially patrolled by riot police. This level of suppression that's going on now, it seems to me that more and more people are aware of what's going on at the popular level, certainly on college campuses. So isn't this the best moment to say what we want to pursue is what we really believe in, at least what I really believe in, I think my brothers share this too, is a one democratic and secular state where all citizens can be equal. And like, why don't we, like, if we're pushing for an ideal in the face of viciousness and violence and genocide, why don't we push for a true democratic, just, equality for all kind of situation, rather than a two-state solution that we all know is gone. And even if it were realized, it would still leave the refugees out of the picture. It would leave the Palestinian citizens inside pre-48 or pre-67 as second-class citizens. So yeah, I don't know what you think about that.
I have no problem with that. I'm taking a different approach, but it's a perfectly reasonable approach, you're saying. My approach is, again, all of it is against the odds. Your approach, my approach, believe me, it's against the odds. You know it too. But my approach is change one vote because it's in the U.S. national interest to change that vote, and go with the fact that we are with the overwhelming sentiment of humanity to act now. So that's why I'm taking the approach that I am. But I understand what you're saying completely. I don't disagree with it either.
Okay, Jeff, I know we need to wrap. It's interesting now, as we record, we have Amos Hawkin, who's in Lebanon, Biden's mediator, supposedly, for the. And what's interesting is that he's, of course, an Israeli citizen too. So he's an Israeli American, and that
you can't make this stuff up.
You can't make it up. I mean, it's literally it's almost impossible to understand where American policy starts and where Israeli policy ends, and it just seems to be literally embodied in Amos Hawkin. And when he comes in, he's sort of
and here, Douglas Feith and Paul Wolfowitz and many others along the way.
That's right. So let's hope that what we're ending with in a sense.
But I think that the point I would make is I'd make a general point about American politics that I think is worth making. This strange fact that Israel captured American foreign policy is not unique in the American political milieu. American power is for the buying, basically. And not only on the question of the Middle East, but on the question of the health sector, on the question of the military industrial complex more generally, on the question of big ag, on the question of finance. And the American system is a very interesting system. It's an extraordinarily plutocratic and corrupted system where money buys you ownership. Our government basically is now owned and operated, and it'll be interesting to see. It's owned and operated by Silicon Valley this time around. This is the big purchaser. They basically have the big prize. Okay, it's a dynamic sector of the U.S. It's quite interesting. On the other hand, it's increasingly in line with the military also. So I have a lot of worries about it that maybe we're seeing Orwell completely come to life this way in the version of Palantir and others. But you buy American policy. And by the way, at a pretty low cost. It's not like AIPAC, for example, spends all that much money. $100 million is pathetic. These people are so cheap, so unbelievably cheap. For now, it's probably $500 million that you need. You buy tens of billions of dollars of armaments. You buy whole wars out of this for nothing. I mean, you can't get leverage like this almost in any other business venture in the whole world. So at least and the American people are really sick of it, by the way. They know, do you trust your government? Hell no. Do you trust the Congress? Well, 10% say yes, but that's because 10% will say yes to anything you ask. But nobody basically trusts the Congress at all. Do you think politicians act in the American interest? No. Then you go to specifics. Do you support American foreign policy in the Middle East? No. And so on. What's the lesson? Well, one lesson could be, if you're an investor, buy into it. If you're a forecaster, understand it. If you're, kind of an academic who wants to dream that something could get better, at least point out, this is really screwed up. This is not making America great. This is not even allowing America to be sovereign. This is not in our interests. It's not in our security. It's making the world a lot more dangerous. Attack Iran? Yeah, brilliant idea. Next step to world war. Especially Iran and Russia will sign a security agreement on January 17th. All right, great stuff, Bibi. Tell us your next genius move. You've already created so much destruction all through your region. So all I'm saying is we should understand arguments about what's right and wrong, legal, not legal, in American interest, not in American interest, may or may not be relevant at all. But at least for me, it's just about the only thing I have is to try to say this makes no sense. We need to do something different.
Professor Sachs, thank you so much for joining us on this podcast. We really, really appreciate all your insight and look forward to listening to all your other podcasts. We know that you do this regularly, so we really look forward to following up on you on this.
Well, great to be with you. Thanks so much. Thanks for such an interesting discussion.
Okay, guys, I thought this was a really interesting discussion with Jeff Sachs. I know we were pushing him towards the end, especially about the question of Palestine and the question of two-state solution versus, I don't know, one state or whatever one wants to call that. Osama, I know you had something. What is it? What do you think?
Well, I agree with you. I thought it was a fascinating discussion. I thought it was, there's a kind of at the macro level in terms of de-dollarization, in terms of U.S. global hegemony, in terms of the unipolarity and the myths of U.S. unipolarity lasting forever. I think that is, he's very strong on that. And then when it comes to Palestine, as he said there's a genocide going on. It's awful. We all agree, of course, about that. But then the solution is a two-state solution. And I kept thinking, so incisive at one level of analysis, and then it struck me as more sort of idealistic in a certain kind of way of a two-state solution.
Yeah, but he admits that
no longer.
In other words, he's very clear. Like for him, the two-state solution is not something that's a practical or achievable thing because of all the obvious. So when I was talking about the one-state solution,
I get it.
He said yes, that's. But for him, it's like this.
But he said that's your point of view.
But the point is, it's like and it's what I'm saying. Like, he recognizes that. So for him, the two-state solution isn't so much an actual solution. It's rather something to say,
it's one step along the way because
it's
the
one
UN,
step. It's one step towards something better.
Yeah, because the UN, Karim, right? This is your bailiwick in the sense that the UN, the international community has overwhelmingly endorsed this so-called two-state solution. Karim, my understanding is that he's saying, well, that's the least.
That's what Norman Finkelstein also says, by the way, Osama. That's always Finkelstein's line, is that there are laws backing the two-state solution. There's nothing in favor of the one-state.
No, but this is true. The simplest thing.
Yeah, but that doesn't. So what?
Now, let me just say, in other words, from somebody who operates within the policy world, which is where Jeff Sachs is, right? He's always on that level. He's dealing with leaders all over the world, all across the world, from China to the global South to the West to wherever. So when you're saying, okay, what is the simplest possible solution at a practical policy level? It's all you need is the U.S. to kind of remove its veto to accept Palestine as a state.
How do we get to that?
That's it. I'm just saying, like that's it. That's literally, there's nothing else to be done except for this one country to change on that. That's it.
I see that point, Karim. I see that point because it's also, You can see how, and the thinking, you can see very clearly, this is the least, what is it? There are the fewest obstacles in the way, right? Isn't that's the idea?
One
It's the
obstacle.
path of
There's
least.
one obstacle. There's one obstacle. That's it.
So
U.S.
then
veto.
that begs the question, or that leads
Well,
to the
there's
question
Vanuatu
about,
too. Don't forget.
No, but this veto. It's a question of the veto.
but it begs the question about like what happens, how do you get that shift to occur in U.S. policy, given his analysis that the U.S. policy making is completely, he said it's captured by the pro-Israel lobby, by AIPAC and company. As he says, all of U.S. politics is, so we go back to the Mearsheimer Walt story about U.S. policymakers are bought and sold by endless numbers of lobbies in many different fields, but in the Middle East it's AIPAC, obviously.
Although, by the way, it's interesting. His emphasis wasn't so much on AIPAC; it was more individuals within the U.S. government. When Karim brought up Amos Hawkin at the end, he said there was, what's his name, Wolfowitz, the architect.
He said AIPAC in terms of like the return on investment.
They work together, obviously, all of these.
But it's more. I mean, you're talking now, Elon Musk is on a rampage. You're talking about Zuckerberg. You're talking about all these people that control large parts of social media. You're talking about the attacks now on TikTok in the United States because a lot of young people were using TikTok to get live streaming of the genocide.
The lobby said it must go.
Exactly. So, and all this becomes clear. So it's not just AIPAC per se. It's that whole kind of constellation. And I think what he was suggesting at the end, and what I think we always talk about here, is that there is a shift in the public discourse. There's a shift in the public opinion, not discourse, in the public opinion in the United States, and that at some point, hopefully, will have some kind of bearing on the U.S. obstacle in terms of removing its veto or not. Beyond that,
that's where we got to. Yeah, that's where we got to with our discussion with John Mearsheimer last week.
I mean, he's not Palestinian. He's not Palestinian, so he's not going to say, "Well, you have to pick up guns and fight," and there are other ways to do it. That's for
I understand.
But
can we just wrap on this point about? Look, you're in Beirut right now, and you're surrounded by people, I am sure, given the media that we're reading, you're surrounded by people who are, like Hawkin, gloating and crowing with the sense that victory has, been achieved, right? Am I wrong about this? And so I'm wondering, how do you reconcile that view in the region, especially among the more conservative forces that are allied or tied or subordinate to the U.S.? How do you reconcile that view with his view that the U.S. is delusional? I mean, that to me, I'm just keep trying to. I struggle with that all the time.
Well, it's a short term. I think the idea is a short term versus a longer term thing. I think it's very easy. It's not difficult to say the Israelis won and the Americans won in this sense, and Hezbollah was defeated and Iran is weakened, and of course, this is. I mean, at a certain level, it's pretty easy to say that, and they're making use of that to try to shift from this kinds of what appears to be certain kinds of military victories into strategic ones or political ones, and that hasn't happened yet. So what I will point out is, of all the gloating, there is gloating in a lot of circles in Lebanon that Hezbollah was. There's not so much that they're pro-Israeli; it's that they want to see the kind of ending of Hezbollah as the main force inside Lebanon. That's true. On the other hand, Hawkin did come in. And he did give a speech today, or a press conference, and he did say the Israelis are going to withdraw. And the Israelis have said the same. So you're in this thing where within that 60 days, within the truce, if the Israelis do withdraw, what is the implication to you? The implication is, when you look at Syria, you look at Lebanon, you look at these countries, you see, and look at the West Bank, you look at Gaza, you see that the country that resists, and this is Lebanon in particular, let's say, the Israelis withdrew. In Syria, there was no resistance. They've taken it and they've expanded, and there's no way that the Israelis are going to withdraw. Forget the Golan Heights. I'm even talking about Mount Hermon and the other places that they've taken. When are these guys ever going to withdraw? In Lebanon, they're going to withdraw. At least I think they are. And so what does that tell you? So yes, you can go on the gloating all you want, but on the ground, you can also see that there was a, if you don't want to say military victory for Hezbollah and the resistance on the ground in the south, you can certainly say the Israelis absolutely failed to achieve their main military objective, which was to destroy Hezbollah militarily speaking, not in the kind of ground, not in leadership and decapitating and killing Nasrallah, all of which were massive blows, don't get me wrong, for the larger political and strategic things. But on the ground, in terms of the military, they did not win in the south, And they were unable to advance beyond a few kilometers from the borders, no matter what their propaganda was going on about. They simply, even in Khiyam, they were unable to really push through it. So you're talking about a country like Lebanon, which was able to resist the Israeli military through the 80s, increasingly through the 90s. In 2000, there's liberation. 2006, the Israelis did this massive attack. Ultimately, like it or not, they were unable to achieve any of their objectives in the 2006 war. Hezbollah gets stronger, and that's part of their demise. Ultimately, is the fact that they became too big, too strong. They went to Syria, they grew, they became a massive bureaucracy, and so they were infiltrated more. There was more corruption inside. There was all sorts of things, and this is things that they're going to be dealing with right now. But in Lebanon, in the core military resistance part in South Lebanon, they held, in a sense, the barbarians to bay. They did that, and so with all the bloating that takes place, we cannot forget that is a fundamental aspect. And if anybody, and I've had this discussion with people here, if anybody thinks that the Israelis would not have occupied South Lebanon, or at least large chunks of South Lebanon, one needs to only look at Syria today to see that that is delusion, utterly delusional.
I agree completely, Karim. It's not just, they've also been talking about Southern Lebanon since the 1950s.
For 100 years. No, more. For 100 years.
No, but like that's in textbook. I'm talking about in terms of policy. They've long wanted to occupy South Lebanon, south of Litani, take the water, install a puppet government in Beirut. Like this is like going back.
They wanted in World War I. They wanted the borders of Palestine to be at the Litani River.
I understand.
Palestine borders. That's 100 years.
I'm agreeing with you. I'm completely agreeing with you. I would also add, by the way, same thing in Gaza. For all the devastation that they've inflicted on the people of Gaza, they're unable to accomplish their prime task, which is destroying or eliminating Hamas. So in other words, they have we've said this many times on this podcast. They have a capacity to inflict massive harm, but that does not necessarily translate into the attainment of political objectives. That's what Jeff was talking about when it comes to the U.S. They can kill millions of people. That doesn't mean they win, right? So we have to disaggregate the infliction of harm from the accomplishment of military or even political objectives. I think that's important to bear in mind.
Yeah, I think this is a good place to start.
I think it depends. I think it depends also on the time scale we're using, because at a certain sort of time scale, you could say that what he was talking about, Jeff was wrong when he said that the Arab states have never used their leverage. It's not true. I mean, they did try. They tried it
once.
They tried
in 73.
No, not just in 73. They tried, but also they were part of a UN bloc. They did vote in the 50s and 60s. Come on,
yeah, but
it's not true that they didn't. They didn't. I mean, Abdel Nasser.
By the way, also the Arab peace plan. I mean, like it or not, that was the Arab attempt to reconcile what they saw as a reality and say, okay, let's just deal with it. 67,
exactly.
2 states,
and they were ignored
completely.
And they were ignored completely. But the point is that there was this leverage in the past, and the question is, how do we get back? I don't know. I feel that there's so many different levels of analysis that we're operating under. But from a U.S. perspective, you could say that the Arab position has been defeated, or was, in terms of a shorter, like if you take it from where the Arab states were in terms of their discourse in 48 versus where they are today, you could certainly say the U.S. has, quote, officially won. But it hasn't, of course, eliminated resistance. And the whole point is that resistance keeps generating because the conditions are so fundamentally unjust. Does that make sense, guys, in terms of what are you talking about? Like,
yeah, but if we connect this to the first part of the conversation with Jeff, if you say also some of the threats to American economic power, which is the basis of its military and political power, which are coming.
Yeah, correct.
At some point that also raises questions for how long can the U.S. literally how long can it afford to do what it's doing, and hence how long can? Yeah, I know that's what I'm saying.
It's the global economy and the threats that are coming from BRICS, etc. All the stuff Jeff was talking about, and it's also inside the U.S. the change in public opinion across the board, even among evangelicals, young evangelicals, are saying,
yeah, exactly. Nothing is a done deal. Nothing is steady state here.
One last point, I think one last point, and this to respond to Osama as well, is that one lesson I've drawn is not that the Israelis are actually very, very weak. Without the United States, the Israelis would not have been able to do anything.
Absolutely.
Neither in Gaza, not in Lebanon, nowhere. It's absolutely, this is more than ever. The Israelis
not even protecting themselves from Iran.
October 7th, they were unable to protect themselves.
No, from Iran too, like that whole missile thing.
The missile from Iran, but I'm talking even October 7th, we're talking about what they ended up doing in Gaza would not have been done without the United States, without Biden in particular, and Blinken and Sullivan, and
who
Jeff
just gave them
Trump.
another $8 billion, by the way. As
That's
a
right,
parting
just
gift.
right now. That's right.
This is the definition, guys. This is the definition of a Pyrrhic victory for the Israelis.
There's no victory.
Insofar as like they're gloating about their victory. It's
Yes.
so how Pyrrhic is it? And when you say the Hochstein was gloating, this is all Pyrrhic victory stuff.
Yeah. Hawkin, by the way.
But with a human cost, unfortunately.
Oh, obviously. Yeah.
Yeah. Hawkin was last seen at Starbucks getting a coffee at Starbucks, and some Lebanese going and telling him, "Oh no, please, you don't pay here. We're Lebanese. We're hospitality. We don't let anybody pay, any guests pay." So the country is split in that sense.
Before we wrap, I just wanted to ask our listeners, our audience, please, if you could give us a review both on YouTube and on Apple Podcast or wherever you're listening to the show. Basically,
not a review, a good review. Good review.
Well, obviously, a good review. Because it helps, not for our vanity, but because it does help improve the visibility of the show. So if you're getting something from this show, from all these guests we've had, from our own discussion and analysis, please, if you can rate the show and give it a review and support it, including, if you can, support it on Patreon, which basically we use to cover the expenses of producing the show. That would be very helpful, because if you like what you're hearing, then having more people have access to it will hopefully benefit others as well.
Where do you get Patreon, Sari? Where do you get the Patreon? Because I think a lot of people can't find it.
It's in the link. It'll be in the show description below.
It's in the show description. It's in all. So you can also go or go to Patreon and just look for us there too. But yeah, thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.